Well, hello everyone. My name is Amy Lugo. I am the founder and CEO of Lone Star Health Solutions, a managed care pharmacy consulting company. And I'm delighted to be with you to share with you session 5 of our 5-part webinar series about the National Student P&T competition. And our goal, along with my colleague Kristen Patty, we put together this series to help improve the quality of submissions being submitted for the P&T competition. So today's goal is to go over indirect evidence and why and how would you use this information about indirect evidence? Well, all of it comes back to improving your monograph and your PowerPoint. And ultimately, indirect evidence is often used in the absence of head-to-head studies or in the absence of systematic reviews and meta-analysis. Now, the goal is to obviously we want the highest quality evidence, and indirect evidence is not evidence, really, right? It's the absence of evidence, but it's a great way if multiple drugs have the same endpoint to look at things in terms of how did this drug improve A1C from baseline, and how did this drug compare A1C from baseline? There's no head-to-head studies. Maybe you don't have systematic reviews and meta-analysis. This is a great way to inform value. So you will use indirect evidence when you're synthesizing to, all of the evidence to make a recommendation to the P&T committee, when you're developing PA criteria, when you're addressing alternatives in the background section as well, and then when you're putting together your clinical evidence tables. You have seen this evidence pyramid by now probably 5 times. Our goal was to include this in each of the webinars because it's so important. So your randomized placebo-controlled trials that were likely used for your drug for the P&T competition, that's the very minimum that you would want to share with during, in your monograph and in your PowerPoint. It's the very minimum you would want to share with any P&T committee. So if you're ideally looking for higher quality evidence like systematic reviews and meta-analysis, but let's say if you don't have any of those, then indirect evidence is a way to compare and to just inform the value of this drug. So I have a couple of examples for you. They include myasthenia gravis, GLP-1s and comparison for weight loss, as well as GLP-1s and major adverse cardiovascular events in the diabetes space. So I want to share those with you. Notice how I've titled this. It's very important that you make it clear that this is indirect evidence or an indirect comparison. What I've done here is included all of the drugs that are used in advanced refractory myasthenia gravis, a little bit about the study design for these drugs, for the studies, the numbers included, the endpoint analysis. And what's key here is that you're looking at, they all have to have the same endpoint. Fortunately, the FDA will often put out guidance for industry to say if you're evaluating a new drug for a certain disease state, you need to include this endpoint as a primary endpoint. And so what happens is you're able to build some sort of table for indirect comparison on the same endpoint. So notice how they all have a change in MG-ADL, which is the myasthenia gravis activities of daily living scale from baseline. So for example, for eculizumab, at week 26, they evaluated the change from baseline in MG-ADL, and it was a change of 4.2 for the drug versus 2.3 for placebo, a treatment difference of 1.9. And as you go down for each of these studies, Champion, RAISE, ADAPT SC, the sub-Q version, MyCaren G, and so forth, you're able to evaluate that same endpoint compared to placebo. Notice there's no head-to-head studies in this space at all. And so this is a perfect example where I want to evaluate how each drug changed made that primary endpoint. Yes, they've evaluated them at different time periods, but it's helpful to inform value. It's helpful to inform effect on a particular endpoint and so forth. There's always limitations, and you just have to verbalize those or state those or put them on the slide. But this is our best chance here when there's no head-to-head studies. I will say that there are a whole bunch of systematic reviews and meta-analysis in this space, but let's say that there weren't. This is a great way to inform value with an indirect comparison. My second example for you is looking at tirzepatide, semaglutide, and liraglutide, specifically in the obesity space, the weight loss space. So these drugs, there have been some active comparator studies here, but let's say that there's nothing at all that tells you anything about head-to-head. So this is a great way, again, FDA has said if you're studying obesity and weight loss, you need to have certain endpoints. And so they all have included these in their placebo-controlled trials. And so notice how weight loss in excess of placebo is your top row. We can see tirzepatide at 17.8% from baseline. They also have included at least a 5% weight loss, 10%, 15, and 20% weight loss, as well as waist change in waist circumference. So this is a great way to compare these drugs and different doses, for example, here of semaglutide, in terms of certain endpoints that they all had. And this is a nice way to just look at it in terms of one versus another, always recognizing that there's limitations. My last example I wanted to share is in the diabetes space. So every diabetes drug, the FDA requires that they have a cardiovascular endpoint study. And so this will be done, and these take years to complete. But notice how I've got the study listed, the drug, the population. Now this is really key because your patient population, right? You can't extrapolate one to another if they had different patient populations. So I've got those included. Most all of them have cardiovascular disease or high CV risk. Some of them included patients with CKD already. They have an endpoint of a 3-point MACE. That means a 3-point major adverse cardiovascular endpoint. This is a composite endpoint, and which is usually a 3-point MACE is CV death, non-fatal MI, or non-fatal stroke. They evaluated the endpoint at different time periods. That is important to note as well, and come up with a number needed to treat that's listed there for you. So all of these studies showed a decrease in the composite 3-point MACE endpoint, which is wonderful. Now you have to dive a little deeper sometimes, right, to know, okay, what was that composite endpoint driven by? So I've also included detail there, like only non-fatal stroke had a reduction that was statistically significant. Could be different things for different drugs. But this is an indirect comparison because there's been no head-to-head studies with major adverse cardiovascular, for MACE endpoints in the GLP-1s for diabetes. But it's nice to look at it as a whole to see is one better or not. And you have to be real careful about conclusion statements here, but you can say things like, in an indirect comparison, over 4 years, liraglutide did the following, something like that. You just make it very clear that in an indirect comparison, such and such was superior to this at that. It's a great way to look at things as a whole from a big picture. So in summary, an indirect comparison, it's often used in the absence of head-to-head studies and the absence of systematic reviews and meta-analyses, because you ultimately want to stick with higher levels of evidence, higher quality of evidence. But an indirect comparison of 2 or more agents with the same endpoint, it can be really valuable and enlightening to look at something from a big picture standpoint. Of course, every study or evaluation has its limitations. You just need to state them, put them on the slide, let people know that it was an indirect comparison, and certainly that there are limitations with that. But our final thoughts for this 5-part webinar series, a thorough search methodology will set you up for success. You want to understand the entire body of evidence for a new drug, for a disease state. And so in doing that, your search methodology is really important. If you don't put in the right information in the beginning, you're going to get bad output at the end. Evaluating a drug's placebo-controlled trials, it's the bare minimum for evidence review. As judges in the competition, a P&T committee is always going to be looking for comparative effectiveness. Well, how does this new drug compare to what we already had available, compare to the other drugs in the class? And systematic reviews and meta-analyses, they are very useful in providing ideas or insight into comparative effectiveness. You do want to research the pipeline using clinicaltrials.gov, using individual manufacturer websites. Sometimes review articles can give you nice tables or information where they've already done some research for you. But you always want to consider the pipeline because that will impact your new drug's future in market access and so forth. We want to thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate that you've spent your time with us. There are all sorts of resources available on the P&T competition page, which can be found on the AMCP Foundation website. There are archived sessions and training webinars there, sample drug monograph, and the AMCP Managed Care Pharmacy Primer Series can be found there. To take part in the National Student P&T competition, you do have to be an active paid student member. We would love for you to join today if you are not. And then visit the AMCP Student Pharmacist Center website. You can find stuff about APPEs, leadership programs, committees that you could be on, student awards, mock interviewing, and so much more. Visit the AMCP Foundation website to find information about scholarships and grants, information about managed care residencies and the best poster competition research, all sorts of great things on that AMCP Foundation website. Lastly, as always, if you have questions about the National Student P&T competition, you can email pt@amcpfoundation.org. With that, we thank you so much and hope that you have found this webinar series useful.